Warm greetings to all. This is really an exceptionally good conference, and I wish I could be there. I've been there in past years. This is the first time I haven't been able to attend. But I did want to share with you some observations on the critical theme you're discussing, the theme of identity, and how digital technology, the tool of digital technology, can help us overcome some of the formidable challenges around identity that we face today. 1 billion people on Earth do not have an adequately documented identity. That's 1 in 7 people. And that makes a massive difference throughout their lives. It can even be life-threatening. The absence of identity means that it's very difficult to get into a school. The absence of identity means it's very difficult to access other government services. The absence of a proper identity can mean that one hovers in a grey area between legality and illegality. It can lead to arbitrary arrest, arbitrary imprisonment, or even worse. It can deprive one of all sorts of opportunities, not only for education, but for any sort of aid. And it's something that can be passed from one generation to another. The absence of identity can make it much more difficult to register a marriage, to register a birth. So it is a pressing problem that keeps 1 billion people excluded from a society and the benefits that would bring. Many countries have tried to overcome, a growing number of countries, I should say, have tried to overcome this problem by using digital means. Estonia is an example, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uruguay are other examples, because digital means can provide cheap, easily accessible ways to making progress. But the truth is, and I'll come back to this, the digital tools we have can be tremendously empowering and liberating, but they can also be constraining. They can be a source of access to help, or they can be a tool of surveillance. I think Brad Smith, in a book I'd recommend to all of you, summed it up very well in the title of that book, Tools and Weapons. And digital technology can be used in both ways. But let's focus first on the opportunities. Digital identity can be tremendously empowering for individuals. Apart from capturing people who otherwise would have difficulty having access to an identity, it can also give people who may have had an identity new forms of access that they didn't have. The access to finance mechanisms, the access to banking have revolutionized the lives of the poor in many parts of Kenya and elsewhere in Africa. So it can increase economic opportunities. It can also bring unaccounted for, marginalized people into the global economy. It can help with land titles. It can help with voting rights. It can help be a means for the realization of human rights. So digital identity can truly both bring in people who had no identity, but also give a boost to the poorest of the poor who may have had a proper documented identity, but will not have had the same economic opportunities or political opportunities that they can gain through a digital identity. Perhaps the best example of the benefits on this on a third level is Estonia. Estonia now does virtually all government services by digital means. All Estonians have a digital identity. And apart from the benefits I've already outlined, this has had a massive effect in allowing Estonia to reduce bureaucracy. I think the calculations is that since they introduced this, they've saved no less than 800 years of working time. I think the average amount it takes an Estonian now to fill out their tax forms online is something around 3 minutes. They have digital cabinet meetings that also last about 14 minutes or something like that. So the ability to take resources from heavy government services, bureaucracy basically, and redirect those resources that you're saving into services that have a tangible impact on your citizens, healthcare, education is huge where governments go digital. It has to, however, be, and I think Estonia is a good example of this, it has to be accompanied by systems of transparency. In Estonia, anytime any government office goes into your records for any reason, you get a text message, you get an email, and you can hold the government entity to account. So it's a system with total transparency. Even if it's just as simple as a police car reading your number plate, you will be told, you will be informed, and you will have the right to ask that police entity why they read your number plate at that point. And that means that the citizens have faith in the system, have faith in their national institutions. They see the digitalization as empowering and not as a tool for further surveillance. And I think that's really important. There are also examples in the UN of where we're pioneering the use of digital identity. The World Food Programme that provides support to almost 100 million people across the world who are in need of food aid are increasingly using digital identity and iris scanning tools to give people their food entitlements in war zones. And this is a huge improvement. When I worked in the field in Sudan in the 80s and in my subsequent career, refugees, IDPs, they had little ration cards that were made of cardboard and had holes punctured in them when they got their ration distributed. But as you can imagine, those ration cards were traded, they were sold, they were stolen, and often the people who needed the food most, the weakest among the refugees, the women, the children, were not getting it because their cards had been taken away from them. But with iris scanning, there is no cheating, and we can make sure that the food gets to those who need it most. A partner agency of the UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross, are increasingly digitizing the records of war victims. So people in conflict areas who from one moment to the next could be asked to flee are now able to go online, have their land titles digitally kept through with blockchain technology in ways that they cannot be stolen or falsified, having their university and school certificates retained digitally in a safe place by the International Committee of the Red Cross. That means if they have to flee and they forget their paper certificates, they will be safe. They will have access to studying opportunities, either when they return or elsewhere. They will have the records to show. So again, in this manner, even in the humanitarian system, in the UN system, we're using these new technologies to try and help those who need it for most. What do these examples have in common? I think what they have in common is they adopt technologies based on the needs of the most marginal. They adopt technologies from the point of view of those most in need, from the point of view of individual human beings. It's not a question of a government or an authority or an entity saying, how can we best surveil a population? What technologies will use us? Or a business saying, how can we best sell our bubble tea or our hamburgers? What technologies can we use? And how can we use data to do that? No, the starting point here is the individual needy human being. It's not business interests, it's not surveillance interest, it's the interests of individuals. And I think that's what defines technology for good, as opposed to technology that maybe curtails access and ultimately is used as a weapon. And I think there we do need to be open-eyed about the dangers. I mean, this conference is taking place in Berlin, more or less on 30 years to the day to when the wall fell. There are many reasons why the wall fell when it did, why the Cold War came to an end, why the Soviet Union fell apart. But in the case of Germany, historians point to one reason, that the state of surveillance had got so elaborate and so sophisticated that it simply could not keep up with the records it collected. the infamous Stasi, the East German secret police, collected tons and tons of records through an incredibly elaborate spy network where children spied on their parents, where colleagues spied at one another, where within couples people were spying on one another. And it had this mass of evidence that it used for social control. And what many argue is that ultimately one of the reasons of its failure is that it accrued so much material that it was unable to process. It was in data overload that, in fact, paralyzed the surveillance system. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you can still visit those files in East Berlin. And if they were put one piece of paper next to another, you'd have literally 69 kilometers of spy materials. Now, the truth is that if the East Germans had artificial intelligence at the time and not be dependent on paper records, we might still have East Germany today, because they would have had no problem about processing all that spy data. They wouldn't have also needed all the human hands to gather it, and they certainly would have been able to process it. And I think that illustrates that AI is not necessarily a neutral tool. It lends itself, and others have made this point more eloquently than I. Some people have said it has authoritarianism in its DNA. And today it's already been used for surveillance, and it's already being used for commercial surveillance to boost sales, and in the ways that our architecture of choices as consumers is manipulated every day through the advertising that reaches us through our social media accounts. And even more so, of course, and more controversially so, some of our political choices in ways that have been well advertised. So I'm not saying that to distract from the many incredible uses for good that the same technology can facilitate, the way it can bring in the poorest of the poor into development opportunities, into political opportunities. But I think we have to be mindful of these constraints. And we have to ask ourselves hard questions. What should be the legitimate limits to privacy? In an era where data gathering, basically, as many have pointed out, means that social platforms can know us better than we know ourselves. Where are the limits, be it for commercial purposes or political purposes? What are the legitimate limits that should be set for the level of intrusiveness of technology? And also, how can society better steer these technologies for good? What sort of policy frameworks and regulation do we need to ensure that happens, rather than leaving it simply to the invisible hand of the market or the invisible hand of tech developers, with huge respect for tech developers? So I think we have to understand not just the limits that need to be set in terms of protecting our own privacy, but also we have to be much more aware of the social, human rights and political consequences of some of these frontier technologies. We cannot just move forward and break things, be surprised, and then try and retrofit solutions. As much as policymakers need to become much more tech-oriented, tech people need to become much more ethically oriented, much more aware of the political and social consequences of what they're doing. And we perhaps need something like a Socratic oath, Hippocratic oath, the oath doctors take, that they will do no harm with their knowledge. We probably need something like the equivalent in the tech sector, that everybody who is engaged in that will do their utmost to use their know-how to privilege humanity, especially the least served, most disadvantaged parts of humanity, and contain the bad, rather than just look for tech progress for its own sake. I think what we really need is to get beyond a binary discussion. I mean, I've been very surprised, as somebody who's come to this quite late, that, we tend to emphasize that there tends to be a camp that only sees the dark side, another camp that thinks there's no tech problem that more tech won't solve. Well, that's obviously on both sides hugely simplistic. We need a much more nuanced, complex discussion of both good and bad. And also, I think, and that's why this conference, gatherings like this are so important, we really need to bring together different stakeholders. Tech is much too important to be left to tech experts alone, and politics is much more too important to be left to politicians alone. We need everybody in the debate. We need artists in the debate. We need public policymakers. We need the UN. We need philosophers. We need ethicists. These are problems of our times. These technologies are going to transform the way we live, the way we think. And if we want to make the most of that, we all need to gather together. And I wish I could be part of your gathering because I think it's very important in that process. Thank you.